All right, we are on chapter 7 of Judges, verse 15. Kimmy, can you read that for us to the
Yes.
end?
Yes. When Gideon heard the dream and the interpretation, all he could do was just stand there worshiping God. Then he returned to his men and shouted, "Get up, for the Lord is going to use you to conquer all the vast armies of Midian." He divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each man a trumpet and a clay jar with a torch in it. Then he explained his plan. "When we arrive at the outer guard posts of the camp," he told them, "do just as I do. As soon as I and the men in my group blow our trumpets, you blow yours on all sides of the camp and shout, 'We fight for God and our Gideon and for Gideon.'" It was just after midnight and the change of guards when Gideon and the 100 men with him crept to the outer edge of the camp of Midian. Suddenly they blew their trumpets and broke their clay jars so that their torches blazed into the night. Then the other 200 of his men did the same, blowing the trumpets in their right hands and holding the flaming torches in their left hands, all shouting for the Lord and for Gideon. Then they just stood and watched as the whole vast enemy army began rushing around in panic, shouting and running away. For in the confusion, the Lord caused the enemy troops to begin fighting and killing each other from one end of the camp to the other, and they fled into the night to places as far away as Bethshittah near Zerah, and to the border of Abel Meholah near Tabah. Then Gideon sent for the troops of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, and told them to come and chase and destroy the fleeing army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, summoning troops who seized the fords of the Jordan River at Bethbara, thus preventing the Midians from escaping by going across. Oreb and Zoab, the 2 generals of Midian, were captured. Oreb was killed at the rock now known by his name, and Zoab at the winepress of Zoab, as is now called, and the Israelis took the heads of Oreb and Zoab across the Jordan to Gideon.
That would have made them sound like a fierce army coming in on all sides.
Yep. So there's your answer why 300 men could do it. Remember, we were waiting with bated breath on Friday.
All right, Cindy, whenever you're ready.
Hold on, I have to let my dog out.
I'm curious, what's the significance of holding the trumpet in their right hand and the torches in their left hand?
Where's that at? Because mine just say put trumpets into, thank you. All
It
there.
is 19
Verse 20.
and 20.
Oh, okay. Good point, Kim. Let's see what the commentary says.
Are these the ones that were typically left-hand dominant?
Yeah, we talked about that in the past.
Was that
I forget who that was, but
was that the Benjamin, tribe of Benjamin?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I could be wrong. I'm pulling that out of my, just pulling that out of my memory. They are ambidextrous or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I know too, like one, like the right side was like honor, and like the left hand was used to wipe when they went to the bathroom.
Yes,
So,
that's correct.
yeah, it may be the whole something to do with that. No, let's see what you got, Cindy.
7:15, arise. God said this in 7:9. Newly infused with courage, Gideon is now in step with the Lord. 7:16. Trumpets and torches, at first concealed within clay pitchers, were suddenly displayed at the most startling moment. The shocking impression caused by blaring noise from the always terrible shouts of Israel and sudden light surrounding the sleeping host shattered the stillness of the night and conveyed one idea. Each light could mean a legion behind it. Thus, they believed an incredible host had moved in to catch the awaking army in a death trap.
Oh, so what they were
7,
doing
8.
was, I guess normally a legion would have one light. That they
Yeah,
all
and is a
follow.
legion 10,000?
I think it's 7. Let me look.
Okay.
Well, and it's interesting too. So if these men were obedient, all of the light would be on one side and the trumpet would be on the other. So for whatever reason, I mean, instead of the light being some on the right and some on the left, he wanted it all to be on the same side. I don't know.
A legion in the Roman military, which would have been like during Jesus's time, was 6,000. Like when the demons were in that man and he said, "We are legion," it was 6,000 demons.
Okay. 7:18, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Here was a demonstration of the power of God in harmony with the obedience of man. Such shouts reminded the enemies that the threat of the sword of Gideon and of God was for real. The impression was one of doom, terror, shock, and awe. 7:19, the beginning middle watch. This was about 10 p.m. 7:22, every man's sword against his companion. Panic followed shock. Every soldier was on his own, in desperate retreat. In the darkness and crash of sounds, the soldiers were unable to distinguish friend from enemy. And with their swords, they slashed a path of escape through their own men. That's all I have.
But they took out each other.
Yeah.
Kathy, what's Worsby looking like?
Okay. God honors our faith, but without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Hebrews 11:6. Faith means more than simply trusting God. It also means seeking God and wanting to please him. We don't trust God just to get him to do things for us. We trust him because it brings joy to his heart when his children rely on him, seek him, and please him.
Can you wait a minute?
Yeah,
Faith
repeat that.
means not only trust, not only
Faith means more than simply trusting God.
yes.
It also means seeking God and wanting to please him.
Thank you.
How did God reward Gideon's faith? God gave him wisdom to prepare the army, verses 15b to 18. Gideon was a new man when he and his servant returned to the Israelite camp. His fears and doubts were gone as he mobilized his small army and infused courage into their hearts by what he said and did. The Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand, he announced to the men in verse 15. As Vance Havner said, faith sees the invisible, victory in a battle not yet fought, and does the impossible, wins the battle with few men and peculiar weapons. Gideon's plan was simple but effective. He gave each of his men a trumpet to blow, a jar to break, and a torch to burn. They would encircle the enemy camp, the torches inside the jars and their trumpets in their hands. The trumpets were ram's horns or the shofar, such as Joshua used at Jericho, and perhaps this connection with that great victory helped to encourage Gideon and his men as they faced the battle. At Gideon's signal, the men would blow the trumpets, break the pitchers, reveal the lights, and then shout, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." God would do the rest. Gideon was the example for them to follow. Watch me, follow my lead, do exactly as I do. Verse 17. Gideon had come a long way since the day God had found him hiding in the winepress. No longer do we hear him asking if, why, where. No longer does he seek for a sign. Instead, he confidently gave orders to his men, knowing that the Lord would give them the victory. It has been well said that the good news of the gospel is we don't have to stay the way we are. Through faith in Jesus Christ, anybody can be changed. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Jesus said to Andrew's brother, "You are Simon," which means a hearer. "You shall be called Cephas," which means a stone. You shall be. That's good news for anybody who wants a new start in life. God can take a weak piece of clay like Simon and make a rock out of him. God can take a doubter like Gideon and make a general out of him. God gave him courage to lead the army, verses 19 to 22. Gideon led his small army from the spring of Harod to the valley of Jezreel, where they all took their places around the camp. At Gideon's signal, they all blew their ram's horns, broke the jars, and shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Finding themselves surrounded by sudden light and loud noises, the Midianites assumed that they were being attacked by a large army, and the result was panic. The Lord intervened and put a spirit of confusion in the camp, and the Midianites began to kill each other. Then they realized that the safest thing to do was flee. Thus they took off on a caravan route to the southeast with the Israelite army pursuing. God gave him opportunity to enlarge the army, verses 23 to 25. It was obvious that 300 men couldn't pursue thousands of enemy soldiers, so Gideon sent out a call for more volunteers. I'm sure that many of the men from the original army of 32,000 responded to Gideon's call, and even the proud tribe of Ephraim came to his aid. To them was given the honor of capturing and slaying Oreb, which means raven, and Zeb, which means wolf, the two princes of Midian. The story of Gideon began with a man hiding in the winepress, but it ended with the enemy prince being slain at the winepress. Gideon's great victory over the Midianites became a landmark event in the history of Israel, not unlike the Battle of Waterloo for Great Britain, for it reminded the Jews of God's power to deliver them from their enemies. The day of Midian was a great day that Israel will never forget. And there are references to Psalms and Isaiah. The church today can also learn from this event and be encouraged by it. God doesn't need large numbers to accomplish his purposes, nor does he need especially gifted leaders. Gideon and his 300 men were available for God to use, and he enabled them to conquer the enemy and bring peace to the land. When the church starts to depend on bigness, big buildings, big crowds, big budgets, then faith becomes misplaced, and God can't give his blessing. When leaders depend on their education, skill, and experience rather than in God, then God abandons them and looks for a Gideon. The important thing is for us to be available for God to use us just as he sees fit. We may not fully understand his plans, but we can fully trust his promises, and it's faith in him that gives the victory. The end.
Okay, Tony Evans, 15 through 25 says,
I'm wondering though, how long was it from the time they found Gideon in the wine press to that his ability to that this change in him and that this victory?
well, I'm thinking it probably could not have been that long because he did I mean, they were coming in, so it's within that 8th year. They were coming in, right?
It would be Kim from chapter 6, verse 14 to where we are. That's how long it was.
Yeah. Thank you.
Because he did that, and then they did the lapping, and then and I did go listen to Murray's teaching on that, and he said that true military-minded people would not have gotten down on their knees and bowed to get drinks out of the water. He said they would have stayed alert the entire time that they were drinking and paying attention to their surroundings. He said, because you have to remember, they had this military like locusts that they were watching out for. And he also said about bowing down and something to do with idols too. So that made sense to me after he explained it, that they would have been the ones that were more alert. When Gideon got the boost of encouragement needed, first he bowed and worshiped, no doubt thanking God for it. Gideon then divided the 300 men into 3 groups, and they circled the camp in the middle of the night. Then each man shattered a clay pitcher, uncovered a torch, blew a trumpet, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The noise startled the Midianites from sleep. They assumed they were being overrun by a superior force. In fact, God created such confusion among the enemy that they began fighting one another, and as a result, they were completely defeated and their leaders were executed. God calls us to follow his agenda, even when it doesn't make sense. He wants you to watch and see what he can do in response to your obedience and faith. When God is ready to move, it doesn't matter how big your enemy is. The Midianites were shattered by the power of God working through the people of God in the midst of dark circumstances. Let the church take notice. Even when we don't understand things and think the odds are against us, God calls us to do what he says individually and collectively, and then watch him work. I wonder if I'm just going to look and see if there's anything out there, Kim, on your question.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm asking the right. Yeah, I don't see anything. Just quickly looking. Any other thoughts on that?
I found something, maybe now I can find it. I'll have to send it to the group. I asked on Got Questions. It's the last trumpet, maybe. Why does scripture emphasize the right hand of God, maybe? The right hand of God. And it says about the last trumpet of 1 Thessalonians 4, the same as the 7th trumpet of Revelation. So, oh no, there was another scripture, Matthew 6:3-4. What does it mean when we should not let our left hand know what the right hand is doing? That wouldn't pertain to that, though.
Well, and Jesus stands at the right hand, sits at the right hand of God. He stood for Stephen when Stephen came. He was the first martyr to go to heaven, but so it is significant, the right hand.
At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Psalm 6-11. I do it on like Got Questions, and it didn't come up specifically, but it sort of gives us a general
Yeah.
idea maybe, like right hand of God.
And then the trumpet was in the right hand.
Yeah.
And that would be blown to him, you know. Be victorious towards him.
All right, chapter 8. Mine doesn't take a break until 21.
Yeah.
And Tony's really short on that too in the commentary.
Yeah. Yeah, mine breaks after 21.
Kim, do you want to read that?
8
Yeah.
through, all right. Let me get my light set up here, right. Gideon punishes those who refuse to help. That's Judges 8, 1 through 21. But the tribal leaders of Ephraim were violently angry with Gideon. Why didn't you send for us when you first went out to fight the Midianites? They demanded. But Gideon replied, God let you capture Oreb and Zeb, the generals of the army of Midian. What have I done in comparison with that? Your actions at the end of the battle were more important than ours at the beginning. So they calmed down. Gideon now crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men. They were very tired, but still chasing the enemy. He asked the men of Succoth for food. We are weary from chasing after Zebah and Zalman, the kings of Midian, he said. But the leaders of Succoth replied, you haven't caught them yet. If we feed you and you fail, they'll return and destroy us. Then Gideon warned them, when the Lord has delivered them to us, I will return and tear your flesh with the thorns and briars of the wilderness. Then he went up to the Peniel and asked for food there, but got the same answer. And he said to them also, when this is all over, I will return and break down this tower. By this time, King Zebah and King Zalmunna, with a remnant of 15,000 troops, were in Karkor. That was all that was left of the allied armies of the east, for 120,000 had already been killed. Then Gideon circled around by the caravan route east of Nobah and Jogbehab, striking at the Midianite army in surprise raids. The two kings fled, but Gideon chased and captured them, routing their entire force. Later, Gideon returned by way of Heres Pass. There he captured a young fellow from Succoth and demanded that he write down the names of all 77 political and religious leaders of the city. He then returned to Succoth. You taunted me that I would never catch King Zebah and King Zalmunna. And you refused to give us food when we were tired and hungry, he said. Well, here they are. Then he took the leaders of the city and scraped them to death with wild thorns and briars. He also went to Peniel and knocked down the city tower and killed the entire male population. Then Gideon asked King Zebah and King Zalmunna, the men you killed at Tabor, what were they like? They replied, they were dressed just like you, like sons of kings. They must have been my brothers, Gideon exclaimed. I swear that if you hadn't killed them, I wouldn't kill you. Then turning to Jether, his oldest son, he instructed him to kill them. But the boy was only a lad and was afraid to. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said to Gideon, you do it. We'd rather be killed by a man. So Gideon killed them and took the ornaments from their camels' necks.
Well, that sounds like a very painful death.
Whew.
Thorns and briars.
Yowza.
Great.
Just being
Great.
scraped like a Brillo pad, just being scraped with like a Brillo pad.
Ugh,
All
it'd
right.
be like, that's awful.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine being the one doing that, let alone being the one receiving it.
Mm.
I agree, Kathy. That's just disgusting.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Okay, 8:2, gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim. Ephraim resented being slighted in the call to battle. but was placated by Gideon's compliment. His figures of speech implied that Ephraimite capital punishment of the two fleeing Midianite leaders was vintage of Ephraim, to use an image drawn from their great horticulture. It played a more strategic role than taking part in the vintage of Abiezer, the suicide of the enemy under Gideon's leadership. 8:7 Thorns. Gideon's threatened discipline of Succoth's leaders for refusing to help their brothers came due. He had them dragged under heavy weights over thorns and briars, which painfully tore their bodies. This was a cruel torture to which ancient captives were often subjected. He did it on his return, not wanting to delay the pursuit. 8:9 Tower. They probably had defiantly boasted of their strength and defensibility because of the tower. He kept his promise and more. 8:20 Jether, kill them. Gideon desired to place a great honor on his son by killing the enemies of Israel and God. 8:21 killed Zebah and Zalmunna. The earlier Midianite scourge inflicted on Israel was the worst. So this victory lived along in their minds. That's it.
I was thinking about how you would have been a mighty warrior back then, because you would not have had any protection. If you got caught, this is the torture you were going to go through. That would make you like a real man, and you would become very skilled out of necessity.
Can you imagine, in those thorns and bristles, they would stick in your skin and stay there?
Mm.
And then just to keep doing that until you're dead. You know, just keep
What?
dragging you across there.
I was
Yeah.
wondering, wow, was that just Gideon's idea, or is God okay with that? And
I think it said that that was like the way, I think it said somewhere that that was the way that they
Yeah, it did.
did
Well,
things back then.
there was a footnote. And then so because I'm thinking that, asking that question in my mind, I'm reading these footnotes, and it said Gideon carried out the threat he had made in 8:7. It is difficult to determine whether this act of revenge was justified or whether he should have left the punishment up to God. Gideon was God's appointed leader, but the officials of Succoth and Penuel refused to help him in any way because they feared the enemy. That might 8:7.
Well, I think he took a pause because he didn't do it right away in his anger. He went and did the deed that he was his purpose, and then he came back and followed through with his word.
Yeah.
They could have said, we'll give you food. They were basically saying, we're going to let you die. So then in that case, like, who's right? The one that's starving the military to death, or the one that comes back?
I think they were worried too that if, like they said, if they didn't catch them, then the enemy was going to come back after they had given them food. If they would have given them food and the Midianites found out,
Yeah.
then they were going to come back and do something evil to them.
Yeah, so it's
So-
like, who do we fear more? Who do we fear more? We'll be on that side. All right, what you got, Kathy?
There's a little section here. The chronology in chapter 8 seems to be as follows: Gideon's pursuit of the two kings, verses 4-12, his disciplining of the defiant Jews on his journey home, verses 13-17, the protest of the Ephraimites after he arrived home, verses 1-3, the slaying of the kings, verses 18 to 21, and Gideon's retirement, verses 22 to 35. Each of these events presented a new challenge to Gideon, and he responded differently to each one. Verses 1 to 3, a soft answer for his critics. Why this paragraph is placed here is somewhat of a puzzle. It's not likely that the men of Ephraim would complain to Gideon while they were capturing Oreb and Zeb, and while he was pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna. Fighting the enemy would have consumed all their energy and attention, and Gideon's reply in verse 3 indicates that the men of Ephraim had already captured and killed Oreb and Zeb. Perhaps a delegation from the tribe waited on Gideon when the spoils of war were being distributed after he returned home, and that's when they complained. Knowing that they were a large and important tribe, second only to Judah, the Ephraimites were a proud people. Gideon was from Manasseh, the brother tribe to Ephraim, and Ephraim was insulted because he didn't call them to battle. But why would such an important tribe want to follow a farmer into battle? They had assisted Ehud and Deborah and Barak, but there was no guarantee that they would help Gideon. When you reflect on the way the attack on Midian was handled, it was wisdom on Gideon's part that he hadn't called for volunteers from Ephraim. This proud tribe would have been incensed if Gideon had told the frightened men to go home, and their volunteers would not have tolerated his thinning out the ranks to only 300 soldiers.
Well, it sounds like they're a little arrogant too. Like he got some glory here and they were like jealous of that, but would they have even listened to him as a military leader? I don't think they would have, because he was a farmer.
Yeah. If Gideon had called them and then sent most of them back, they would have created a far worse problem before the battle than they did afterward. Ephraim was on hand to help in the mopping up operations, and that's what really counted. Ephraim, however, missed out on acquiring some valuable spoils of war from over 100,000 soldiers, and this may have been what irritated them. Usually when people criticize something you've done, there's a personal reason behind their criticism, and you may never find out the real reason why. Since David's unselfish law governing the dividing of the spoils of war hadn't been established yet, and there's a reference to 1 Samuel there, those who didn't participate in the battle didn't share in the loot. When the men of Ephraim should have been thanking Gideon for delivering the nation, they were criticizing him and adding to his burdens. As a victorious general, a national hero, and the people's first choice for king, Gideon might have used his authority and popularity to put the tribe of Ephraim in its place, but he chose to use a better approach. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 15:1. Perhaps Gideon's immediate feelings weren't that cordial, but he controlled himself and treated his brothers with kindness. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Gideon proved that he could control not only an army, but also his temper and tongue. It's sad when brothers declare war on each other after they've stood together to defeat the enemy. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Psalm 133:1. It didn't cost Gideon much to swallow his pride and compliment the men of Ephraim. He told them that capturing Oreb and Zeb was a greater feat than anything the men had done from his hometown of Abiezer. Peace was restored, and Gideon returned to the more important task at hand. In Poor Richard's Almanac, Benjamin Franklin wrote, "Take this remark from Richard, poor and lame. Whate'er's begun in angers ends in shame." And King Solomon wrote, "The beginning of strife is like releasing water. Therefore stop contention before a quarrel starts." Proverbs 17:14. Verses 4 to 17. A stern warning for the skeptics. Gideon and his men were pursuing two of the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, knowing that if they captured and killed them, the enemy's power would be crippled and eventually broken. The army crossed over the Jordan to Succoth, in Gad, hoping to find some nourishment, but the men of Sukkoth, however you say that, wouldn't help their brothers. The 2.5 tribes that occupied the land east of the Jordan didn't feel as close to the other tribes as they should have, and Gad had sent no soldiers to help either Deborah or Barak or Gideon. While others were risking their lives, the people of Gad were doing nothing. Ammonites and the Moabites, relatives of the Jews through Lot, failed to help Israel with food, and Gad declared war on them. God declared war on them. Hospitality is one of the basic laws of the East, and custom demands that the people meet the needs of strangers as well as relatives. Hospitality was also an important ministry in the early church, for there were no hotels where guests might stay, and in times of persecution, many visitors were fleeing. The men of Sukkoth were skeptical of Gideon's ability to defeat the fleeing Midianite army and capture the 2 kings. If Sukkoth helped Gideon and Gideon failed, then the Midianites would visit Sukkoth and retaliate. The men of Sukkoth didn't think feeding a hungry brother was an opportunity to show love, but was a risk they didn't want to take, and they were rather impudent in the way they spoke to Gideon. Since Gideon received the same response from the men at Peniel, he warned both cities he would return and discipline them. God gave Gideon and his men victory over the fleeing Midianite host and enabled him to capture the 2 enemy kings. Triumphantly, he retraced his steps and kept his promise to the men of Sukkoth and Peniel. Providentially, he found a young man who was able to give him the names of the 77 leaders in Sukkoth who had refused to help him and his army. He showed them the 2 kings whom the elders said Gideon would never capture, and then he chastised them, apparently by beating them with thorny branches. He then went to Peniel and wrecked their tower, killing the men who had opposed them. There's a note here about the branches, the thorny branches. Some expositors think that Gideon made the men lie down naked on the ground, covered them with thorny branches, and then drove a threshing sledge over them until they died. This seems a brutal way for him to treat his own brother, no matter how meanly they treated him and his men. But it stated clearly that Gideon killed the rebels in Peniel, who had treated him the same way. We must remember, however, that these were cruel times, and every man was doing that which was right in his own eyes. Definitely cool.
Yeah.
Why didn't Gideon show to the people of Sukkoth and Peniel the same kindness he had showed to the Ephraimites and simply forgive them for their offenses? For one thing, their offenses were not alike. The pride of Ephraim was nothing compared to the rebellion of Sukkoth and Peniel. Ephraim was protecting their tribal pride, a sin, but not a costly one. But Sukkoth and Peniel were rebelling against God's chosen leader and assisting the enemy at the same time. Theirs was a sin of a hardness of heart toward their brethren and treason against the God of heaven. Of what good was it for Gideon and his men to risk their lives to deliver Israel if they had traitors right in their own nation? Leaders must have discernment, or they will make wrong decisions as they deal with different situations. Personal insults are one thing, but the rebellion against the Lord and his people is quite something else. We got time to do 18 to 21?
Yeah.
A solemn question for his enemies. When Gideon arrived back home at Orpha, leading Zebah and Zalmunna captive, the procession must have been as exciting as a ticker tape parade. Gideon was a true hero. With only 300 men, he had routed the enemy camp and then pursued the fleeing soldiers across the Jordan as far south as Karkor. He had brought his royal prisoners back, plus whatever spoils the men had gathered along the way. Gideon had a personal matter to settle with these 2 kings because they had been guilty of killing his brothers at Tabor. The text doesn't tell us when this wicked act took place, but it must have occurred during one of the previous annual Midianite raids. How Gideon's brothers became involved and why they were killed isn't explained to us, but the suggestion is that the act was an unconscionable one. According to the Mosaic law, the family was to avenge crimes like this by killing those responsible for the murder.
So they're saying this is something that happened that we don't have any more information on.
Yeah, it sounds like that.
So I'm going to guess, if I were to guess, that the Midians had treated the Israelites this way because they're avenging, and he doesn't have any hard feelings about doing it. You know what? He took the pause. It wasn't out of anger. He took the pause and he came back. I'm going to guess that the Midianites had treated their people this way.
According to Mosaic law, the family was to avenge crimes like this by killing those responsible for the murder. There was no police system in the land, and each family was expected to track down and punish those who had murdered their relatives, provided the culprit was guilty. And there's a reference to Numbers 35. In the case of Zeba and Zalmunna, the culprits were not only murderers, but also enemies of Israel.
Does that 35 have more, or is it just 35?
35, 9 to 34.
Thank you.
The two kings were shrewd in the way they answered Gideon, flattering him by comparing him and his brothers to princes. Someone has said that flattery is a good thing to taste, but a bad thing to swallow, and Gideon didn't swallow it. How could he spare these two evil men who had taken food from the mouths of Jewish women and children and had brutally killed Jewish men? In those days, how a soldier died was important to his reputation. Abimelech didn't want to die at the hand of a woman, and King Saul didn't want to fall into the hands of the Philistines. For a child to kill a king would be the ultimate in humiliation. Thus Gideon told his young son Jether to execute the two criminals. By doing so, Jether would not only uphold the law of the land and humiliate the two kings, but he would also bring honor to himself. For the rest of his life, he would be known as the boy who executed Zeba and Zalmunna. But the lad wasn't ready for either the responsibility or the honor. Even when people are guilty, enforcing justice in the land is a serious thing and must not be put in the hands of children. Because of his fear, Jether hesitated in avenging the murders of his uncles, so the two kings told Gideon to do it. There seems to be a bit of sarcasm in their words, which may be paraphrased. You kill us, Gideon. Let's see what kind of a man you are, or are you also just a child? Zeba and Zalmunna didn't want the inexperienced Jether to execute them because he would have muddled the whole thing and made their deaths much more painful. The kings deliberately aroused Gideon's anger, knowing that he was a good swordsman and would dispatch them quickly, and that's exactly what he did. The end. I don't know how old this boy might have been, but it does seem kind of, in a way, cruel to have him do it.
Well, he was trying to humiliate the kings by like, look, you were killed by a child.
Right. But I mean, when they say young, I don't know, are they talking like teenager? Are they talking 10, 11?
Well, they would have had to be 20 to be in the military, but I don't know that he necessarily was. Because if you're in the military, you would be expected to kill. So I would think he was
Right.
younger than that. Okay. Where am I starting at? At the beginning of 8?
I have a footnote here that I wanted to share because it just kind of brings this into applicable to ourselves. It says, because of fear or over concern for ourselves, we may fail to recognize God's presence in other people or situations, and therefore miss participating in the victory God brings. Then we must face the often bitter consequences of failing to join forces with those God has chosen to do his work. Since God's work will prevail with or without you, be quick to join others who are engaged in godly work, lending support with your time, money, talents, and prayer.
I think that's like so true. Like God is going to accomplish his will, and either you're going to partner with him or you're not. And if you partner with him, you get the blessing of that. And if you don't, then you don't get the blessing of it. Okay, I'm going to read this last Tony part real quick, and then we'll end on 21. The men of Ephraim were upset that they were called at the end of the battle rather than at the beginning, but Gideon told them the mopping up operations were also important, and they were assuaged for the moment. 4 through 9. Gideon and his little army soon grew weary from chasing the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. So they asked the men of the city of Succoth, please give some loaves of bread to the troops. Yet while Gideon was a brother to the men of Succoth, they were not willing to risk siding with him against God's enemies, whom Gideon hadn't actually caught yet. Frustrated by this lack of support, Gideon promised that when he had dealt with God's enemies, I will tear your flesh with thorns and briars. And when the men of Peniel proved similarly disinclined to help, Gideon promised to tear down their tower. 10 through 21. With God's help, Gideon routed what was left of the Midian army and captured the 2 kings. On the way home, he whipped the leaders of Succoth and tore down the tower and killed the men of Peniel, as promised. I guess brothers as in Israelites?
That's what I was wondering, if it was actual brothers or if it's brothers in, like we're sisters in Christ or whatever. Was it brothers because they're Israelites?
I think it would have been, what tribe was Gideon from?
Manasseh.
Okay,
But
so he was
Those
from
men,
Manasseh.
I'm sorry, those men killed Gideon's brothers, the sons of my own daughter. So I don't think these are his real brothers.
They would be
In verse
Israelites.
19, and 18 and 19, then Gideon asked Zebah and Zalmunna, then the men you killed at Tabor, what were they like? And they said they were like you, a king's son. They were my brothers and sons of my own mother. So these the Zebah and Zalmunna, I don't think are his blood relatives.
Right. They would have been, well, I think Zebah and Zalmunna were of the Midianites. But I think the ones that he went back to take through the thorns were Israelites.
That's what I thought. Yeah. Because they weren't helping their own people.
Right. They were going to let
They
them
weren't-
starve and partner with the enemy.
Yeah. Because they were saying about it being treasonous.
Makes more sense to me. All right. Any last thoughts before we hop off and conclude for today? All right. This concludes the reading of God's word for today. Have a nice day, ladies.
Yeah.
Good luck, Chrissy.
Thank you.